Hello, everybody. Today is Monday, December 19th. We are headed into our final week of journeying to Christmas. Y'all, I'm so glad that we've been able to have this time together. I'm so glad that I've been able to go into the season understanding and not caring about what the weather feels like, how the holidays feel to many people at this time, understanding that it's not about the gifts, it's not about trees, it's not about any of that. We set aside this time to celebrate the birth of Christ, and I'm so glad that I was able to take this time to really reflect on why we worship the Savior, why we worship Christ, the child in which was born, grown into a full grown man, into maturity and fulfilling God's will for his only son. I thank God for him daily. And so, in this last week, I've decided to only share one piece of the text that stood out to me particularly in that particular reading. Though I read all of chapter 19 and we see Jesus still doing good teaching and giving the parables and making sure that the people understand the importance of using their gifts for God's glory, understand the importance of being picked out and called out, even when people don't feel like you don't meet the mold, right? This still happens in chapter 19. However, I wanted to only focus on the piece of the text here where Christ makes his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And that's where all I'm going to focus on today. So this video will be very short. It says here that after Jesus was finished telling the story or telling the parables to those around him, he begins to finally make his way into Jerusalem, towards Jerusalem at this point. This entire chapter or this entire book of St. Luke has essentially been Christ making his journey towards Jerusalem to finally fulfill the highest point in his mission. And we finally see that it is now time for Christ to head directly in that direction. But on the way there, he's walking ahead a bit of his disciples, and he finally comes into a town they called Bethphage and Bethany on the Mountain of Olives. And so he tells two of his disciples to go ahead of him and to go into this village, and that they were going to find a colt, a young donkey tied up, one that has never been ridden by anybody before. And so Christ tells them to untie this donkey and to bring it to him. And that if anybody asks why they were doing this, why they were going into this town to get this donkey, to just say that the Lord needed him. I wanted to note here that to make this relational into today's time, I want to note here that it's amazing that Christ, he shows every time how God goes before us and prepares a way and prepares the scene and set the scene for things to be done in our lives. The fact that Christ was able to come into this town and say, hey, you're going to go here, you're going to find this young donkey tied up that had never been ridden, shows God's eyesight exceeds all of us. And so Christ sends his disciples to this pinpointed place, and he says, I want you to bring him to me, and just tell the people, if they ask you, that the Lord needs it. And the fact that this donkey is a donkey that's never been ridden on before essentially shows that our Messiah, our Savior, our pure Messiah and Savior is now riding on a colt, essentially a virgin colt that's never had anybody ride him, that never had anybody use him for his travels, never had anybody think that he could handle a journey, no doubt. Here comes Christ using this donkey to make his way into Jerusalem. Now, he's been walking all this time, but now it's time to ride into Jerusalem because he understands that this moment in time is powerful. And I love the fact that the disciples, they obey him. They don't question him, right? It sounds crazy that he knows that there's a donkey somewhere in this town tied up waiting for him that had never been used. But the disciples have learned him at this point, and they know, hey, if Christ tells us to do something, we better obey. He's proven himself at this point. And just like the time here, Jesus's reputation has gone before him. The disciples know who he is. They've been with him. So they know that if Christ told them to do a thing, they did it and they didn't ask questions. And sure enough, when they go find this donkey, when they begin to untie him, the owners of the donkey come out and they say, "Why are you untying this colt?" And the disciples simply say, "The Lord needs it." And I love the fact that it doesn't tell us that the owners threw any fits, that the owners tried to say, "No, you can't take this, it doesn't belong to you." I believe that these owners, no doubt, knew about the Lord, because the fact that that was all they had to hear to comply lets us know that, hey, the reputation of Christ has already gone before him. They know the Lord is coming. And so I love this. I love that God continues to show, hey, my reputation has already gone before you. I don't care what it is that is what it is you're going through. There, wherever you're headed, God has already been there and he's already laid the groundwork for you. He's shown you time and time again what he's able to do in your life. And so as Christ rides along, the crowds begin to spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. Now the disciples had already begun to take off their garments to sit on top of the colt so that Christ could sit on it. So they feel that Christ is so great. Hey, he can't just sit on this colt. We have to be humble enough to take off our own clothing and put it on this coat. And now people are taking off their garments and laying it on the road before him. So, hey, they see Christ, they see Jesus coming into the city. Now, it's interesting to note here that the people who were essentially praising him coming into the city, they were giving praise, saying essentially, "Long live the king." They saw this Jesus as the coming king. They felt like he was an answer or simply fulfilling the prophecy in Zechariah 9 and 9, saying that, "Behold, your king is coming to you," right? And describing how he would come, having salvation, lowly, what he'd be riding on in Zechariah 9. However, it's funny how Jesus uses this time to announce that he was indeed the Messiah and that Christ had chose a time when all of Israel they would be gathered together, a place where huge crowds and everyone could see him. It would be unmistakable to hear and know the mission of Christ at this time. The people are going wild. They feel like their freedom is at hand. Everybody who's headed now into Jerusalem have no doubt heard of him. Again, his reputation has gone before him. They're headed into the Passover feast, and I'm sure, almost every ear in there has heard who Jesus is. So they feel like their liberation is coming, right? They've heard of the great things he's done. Prophecy is being fulfilled. However, the people were praising God for giving them a king, but they had a wrong idea about Jesus. They expected that he would be a national leader who would restore their nation to its former glory. Thus, they were deaf to the words of their prophets and blind to Jesus's real mission. When it became apparent that Jesus was not going to fulfill their hopes, many people turned against him. I mean, you got to imagine that as Christ is heading into Jerusalem, he reaches a place where his followers are shouting and singing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles they had seen Christ do, saying, "Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in highest of heaven." And the Pharisees there, hey, they know about Jesus and they want him to tell these people to stop praising him like this. But Christ says if they keep quiet, the stones along the road are gonna burst into cheers. These stones are gonna cry out for them. So I can't keep them quiet. However, they were still a bit blinded into the full mission of Christ. They thought that Christ was gonna take over right then, right there at that moment. However, uh they essentially they were still praising him, but essentially they were a bit blinded in their praises. It says here that the the Jewish leaders had essentially rejected the truth about their king, right? They still, in this moment, these Pharisees are still trying to stop the praises being to him, despite the fact that he was due them, despite the fact of who he was. They knew the word so well, but they couldn't understand that the word was made flesh in their face. And so we also have to be careful that when God is doing something in our life, we don't become so blinded by how it was presented to us that we miss out on all of his blessings and we deny the work of God in our life. We got to be careful because as you can see, it's so easy For even God's very elect, you would think, those who know the law from front end to cover and know it like the back of their hand, even they allowed themselves to be deceived and to not fully recognize who they had in front of them. I don't want to ever get into a place where I don't recognize who I have with me, and that's Jesus, right? And so as Christ comes closer to Jerusalem, after he lets these Pharisees know, hey, if these people don't praise me, the rocks are going to cry out. As he comes closer, Jesus isn't happy, right? He understands his mission. He understands his assignment. Instead, he begins to weep, not because he was just so in awe of the praises that was being given to him, but because, hey, he says, I wish today that you of all people would understand the way to peace. But now it's too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you. Again, the Jewish leaders had rejected their king. They had gone too far at this point. Christ had done all of these things in their face, and they still rejected him. They still denied the fact that he was the Word made flesh, that he was God's son, that he was the Messiah. They refused to acknowledge him. They refused to recognize him in the authority and the position that he was. They rejected their king. They had refused God's offer of salvation in Jesus Christ. So when he says the time of thy visitation, hey, you had the chance. You had the chance. He says, I wish that you would understand the way to peace, but now it is too late. I don't want it to be too late. I do not want to miss out on what God is doing because I am rejecting the package in which what he's doing came in. I don't want that to happen to me. It says here that their nation was indeed going to suffer. They had rejected Christ and they had to go through something. They had to suffer. God did not turn away from the Jewish people who obeyed him, though. Uh, he continues to offer salvation to the people he loves, both Jews and Gentiles alike. We all have an opportunity to receive that salvation. And we have to thank God for that. That even though we didn't deserve this salvation, even to the day of his death, he was mistreated. We didn't deserve this, but he did it anyway. So we have a chance to still receive eternal peace as long as we accept the opportunity while it's being offered to us. What Jesus told them would happen to them due to the fact that it was too late and peace was now hidden from their eyes, it indeed came true. Their enemies actually did come against them. And it says here that in AD 66, the Jews revolt against Roman control. 3 years later, Titus, son of the emperor Vespasian, was sent to crush the rebellion. Roman soldiers attacked Jerusalem and broke down the northern wall, but still couldn't take the city. But finally, they laid siege to it. And in AD 70, they were able to enter the severely weakened city and burn it. 600,000 Jews were killed during Titus's onslaught. Can you imagine the pain, right? Christ says here today that this would even affect their children, and indeed it did. They just could not see who he was. Y'all, as we walk towards Christmas, and we realize why we actually celebrate, why we take this time to thank God for the gift of Christ coming into the world, I hope that you realize that you need Christ in your life, that He wants you to recognize Him as Lord and Savior, that He wants to be Lord of all of your life, not just a piece of it. He wants you to receive Him, to receive His word, to receive the message that He brings. Christ wants you to welcome Him. And I want you to know that in the event you choose not to humble yourself and not to receive this Jesus, woe unto you, because There is no other way. We've learned if we've learned nothing in all of these chapters, we've learned that there is no neutrality. You're either for God or you're with Him. You're either accepting Christ or you're not. So I hope as we journey in these last 6 days that you make sure that you take the time to truly dedicate your life, your time, your entire being to Christ so that He doesn't look at you and say, "You've waited too late. You've waited too late." He's coming into Jerusalem. He's about to make the ultimate sacrifice for you. And we have a reason to be thankful. We have a reason to thank God for the gift that is Jesus. Y'all, I pray that chapter 19 has been a blessing to you. And I pray that you will join me tomorrow for chapter 20's standout moment for me. God bless y'all.